of lectures, recordings, the transcriptions of his last or his lecture courses. They're slowly going through them. I mean, he produced about 100 books during his lifetime, which is crazy, or maybe 70. But subsequently, it's almost been one a year since his death as well. The first ones that came out were these fantastic volume 1 and 2. And look, there's that figure of the Greek Anubis again, but this time dressed as a I don't know what he's dressed as here. It looks maybe Greek. Anyway, it's called The Beast and the Sovereign. The Beast in King's Robes. And he was looking at, in this lecture, sovereignty and authority of kings and queens and so on. This is the lecture series from 2002, right? But basically, what he was part of the discussion of that in anthropology was a version of it was in anthropology, they turn to animals, to consider animals in relation to humans and how we have a symbiotic relationship. So 2 big volumes on that. And then even more recently, this is fantastic for work I'm interested in. His lecture course from, I forget which year, 1999, on where he was working on the death penalty, critique of the death penalty, how you could take someone, the violence of taking life, right, hanging, or in this case, the guillotine. So when I visit the guillotine in the War Remnants Museum, carrying this in hand, or volume 2, the second year of the course, ran into second year. A lot of it is about philosophy still, Heidegger and so on, in the year 2000, 2001. This is soon before he died. But going back further, there's a volume came out of the, see, it's made from his lecture notes, which he typed up on a computer, obviously, or were kept. Sometimes transcribed by students. In 1976, 77, he was working on Marx, and Theory and Practice is the volume. He did bring out a book called Spectres of Marx that I think is important to discuss. In 1994, after the fall of the Soviet Union, right, he says, now's the time, and no one was doing it at the time really in culture studies or philosophy, now's the time to read Marx. And that was like untimely. Nobody was reading Marx. The Soviet Union had just wound up just a few years earlier, and Derrida comes out with a text that says Marx, we owe a debt to Marx. Marx was the greatest sociologist, greatest thinker, and we're still haunted by his presence. And he goes on about the whole metaphorics of haunting. The first line of the Communist Manifesto, a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And it's written in 1847, just before the 48 revolution. Whether there was a spectre of communism actually haunting Europe at the time, because it's probably only about 100 communists, by the by, the revolution in 48 also fails as well, and Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power. The nephew of Napoleon the Great comes to power in France and rules for the next 40 years or so, before the Paris Commune. Anyway, his book Spectres of Marx is kind of breaks open discussion of Marx again, although in some ways it's he gets a lot wrong. I've written on this in a book I did, Bad Marxism, but I've said it's his worst book. Some ways it's his most interesting book, and he tries to diagnose world problems. So he's really still relevant, but as I say, he started off with this commentary on Levi-Strauss's structuralism to kind of call an end to structuralism. And then in the 70s, structuralism slowly died and was replaced by post-structuralism, whatever that is. But I want to get on to a presentation of how we might do, at least to experiment with doing a structuralist analysis, all right? And I was thinking about, and I've done this before, so I'm not suggesting it's going to be successful. Levi-Strauss certainly says you shouldn't, at one point he says, just don't apply this to Europe because modern society and it's all complicated and so on. And the story that I want to choose is Snow White, because it's one that we all probably know, and at least the Disney version. There are several versions of the story at least, right? And we can pick up, and we mostly will know the story of Snow White and some of the associated versions of similar fantasies, fables or myths. A myth is not the same as a fable, I know, and with all sorts of provisos that this isn't necessarily true, that this is interpretation, that this is experimental, that this is, probably bastardization of how to do structural analysis. We'll try and go through the steps, all right? Assuming that we've kind of gathered the ethnographic material by knowing about the sort of things that Disney does, the sort of things that children's stories achieve. Like these are stories to teach kids about good behavior and hierarchy and solve their, or give them ways to think about, maybe it's to give them ways to think about relationships in the world, or how your hopes and dreams can be affected by personality. Think of Frozen, right? That someone who blocks out other members of their family turns into an ice queen. Heavy-handed mythology or not, or what? Anyway, in Snow White as well, it's a little bit heavy-handed, but it's tropes we can recognize. So what is the story of Snow White? Let's remind ourselves. All right. Let me try and find where I've put that now. Snow White story. I'd set out the plot. All right, here we go. So Snow White's mother, and Snow White's not born yet, Snow White's mother jabs her finger while she's sewing, doing good work, right? Housework. She's sewing. She's a queen. Anyway, some drops of blood fall on the snow, and then she imagines or wishes that she will have a daughter with snow white skin, blood red lips, and black hair, and 9 months later, her daughter is born, but she dies in childbirth. Father, the king, remarries, and of course, the woman he marries turns out to be a conniving witch. I mean, it's not like Cinderella where she's got two ugly stepsisters and so on, but there's the way. These things tend to happen a lot in remarriages, that the stepmom is bad. I don't know whether you will always experience it like that, but this stepmom of Snow White is the father's new wife, the new queen, is like a bit of a witch. She's a witch. Yeah, she's a wicked witch, and she's got a magic mirror that can see everywhere in the land. And this magic mirror, she asks, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest in the land?" And the mirror keeps on saying, "Well, you are my queen," because I guess she's queen. She has access to the best beauty products or something. I don't know. And the mirror keeps on telling her this until Snow White grows up. And by the time she's 16, she's blossomed into, stepmom's got a bit older. Snow White, 16, in the blossom of youth. And the mirror cannot lie. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest in the land? And the mirror, probably afraid that it's going to get smashed, says, well, Snow White is the fairest of them all. So the stepmother is jealous. Snow White's a beautiful princess, earns the jealousy of her stepmom. The mirror says it. And stepmom decides to have her killed. So that's what stepmoms do, right? Wicked queen. But she gets a hunter to do it. Don't want to get her own hands dirty with the crime. And the hunter, who's worked for the family for however many years, takes her out into the forest, but can't kill her. As thing of conscience and guilt or whatever, and says to Snow White, hide in the forest. You can't come back to the castle. The queen wants you dead. I'm supposed to kill you. I'll kill instead this pig and take the heart back to the queen and say it's you. So it'll think you're dead. And he does that. And Snow White joins up with the dwarves. They work in mines. She finds their hut in the forest and takes shelter there and cleans up their house. Why? She's a princess. She doesn't have to work. She cleans up. And we're dealing with the problem of age and jealousy, right? So the woman, the queen, the wicked queen, the stepmother is still asking the mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fair? And the mirror can see everything. So it can see into the forest and knows that Snow White is still alive and says so. So she's fuming. Yeah. Now maybe, right, the dwarves are to be thought about. We're sort of mixing here the story with analysis already. Sorry, but it just strikes me we can't mention the dwarves and not ask why are the little people working in a mine, right? They're in a forest, but they work in a mine. By the by, all right. Yeah, mirror, mirror on the wall. Snow White's going to be killed by a hunter. Takes the pigs back. She joins with the dwarves. Yeah, it's the problem of age and jealousy, and maybe it's about the relationship of work to success. Now, what the what happens next? The dwarves then you're pretty happy that they've got a new house cleaner, right? Because 7 men living alone, working all day, coming home must have been terrible. I'm sure she didn't do it in just one day, cleaning up their house. Anyway, magic of Disney. She does so. And the dwarves, of course, adore her. And she's kind of happy with their little lives and stuff. And but they're very protective of her. They say, "You be careful. The forest is dangerous. Don't go out ever. Don't let anyone in," and so on. And the wicked queen tries a couple of times to entice Snow White out and have her killed, right? And fails. The dwarves save her a couple of times, but they're really concerned about this. But they don't tell. They tell her not to leave the house, but someone comes to the house. It's a haggard old saleswoman who's selling apples. It's really the wicked stepmom, the queen in disguise, and she tricks Snow White into accepting an apple, a beautiful apple, but it's a poisoned apple. And she bites the apple and is unconscious. The dwarves arrive home. They're devastated, and they put her in a glass coffin. All right. We'll think this will be significant later, the transparency of the glass coffin. Somehow echo with the mirror in the castle that can see everywhere. In the coffin, we can see that Snow White is dead, or she looks dead. Actually, we know she's not dead because the story is unresolved. But along comes a prince, the great, powerful, fair prince, and finds out about the Snow White story and is saddened by it and decides to take her back to the castle where she'll be properly buried. I don't know, he's a prince that likes the order of things, so he's going to return her to the castle. Right? But on the way in his carriage, he's carrying her in the glass coffin. They hit a bump on the road, and that dislodges the apple in her throat. And miracle, she comes back to consciousness and falls in love with him, or she kisses him, or I think she, yeah. Anyway, the prince falls in love, and she responds. She accepts, and they're all going to be. Then she's going to be married and become the princess, the prince and the queen again, and so on. But the wicked queen is still, the wicked witch is still jealous, but the prince is wise to her, and I don't think this is in the Disney version. Gets her to dance in. I have to watch it again with my kids. Gets her to dance in a pair of red hot slippers till she dies. Think of other versions of myths about wicked queens and wicked witches, the red slippers in The Wizard of Oz. I don't know. There are, of course, many variations. Right? Now, we need to plot this somehow onto Levi-Strauss's way of doing myths, right? So we work out the structure of the myth. Think of the oppositions, the forms, and the relationships. And I've put it out on a bit of paper, which I've loaded already. We've got the evil queen and the perfect princess, right? She's 16, but the evil queen's jealous. You've got to get rid of jealousy. She first tries to use, so it's the evil queen, Snow White, who's getting older, young, who's evil and has a magic mirror, who's innocent and good. The hunter comes as the agent of the queen, but he can't do her duty. So he's in between somehow, and he can't kill her. So and releases her to run into the forest, takes her halfway into the forest, then releases her further into the forest, where she goes into the house of the workers. Right? And she does work as well, miraculously, in this house. She does their housework. I don't know why. The queen, of course, never does any housework. She just wanted Snow White's heart in a box and to be the most beautiful. She is then dresses up as a haggard old lady. Like, she becomes even more ugly than her wickedness, and uses a trick to get Snow White to eat the perfect apple that's not the perfect apple. And so we're opposition, poison, good. We're looking at opposition: poison apple, good apple, old lady, young lady, beautiful, don't go out, do go out, in the castle, in the forest, a whole set of binary oppositions. And we see some movement between them. Like the Snow White's moved from the castle to the forest by way of the hunter. And then the hunter is in a position like the prince. The prince comes along and finds her and is going to take the dead Snow White, alive, dead, back to the castle. And something interrupts that journey. So like the hunter interrupted the killing, I suppose, and sent Snow White off into the dwarfs, the prince's journey is interrupted somehow. He can't do what he thinks he's doing the right thing. He does an actually better thing by, well, the accident of her coming back to consciousness, and I don't know. It's not in the film it's not in the film version. It might be. It's not in the story that he kisses her, but they eventually kiss, and they agree to be. At that point, the kids turned away. They didn't want to see kissing in the film, so that's why I don't remember what actually happened. But right, what can we talk about here? The mirror seems really significant because the mirror can see everywhere. Right? It's a magic mirror, and issues of transparency and what you can see in myths are always going to be pretty significant. And then there's the transparent coffin that actually doesn't show the truth. You can see that Snow White is there and she's dead, but she's not really dead, right? and there are issues of transparency in the two different places, and they negotiate between the living and the dead, the bad and the good, the happy ever after, right? Timelessness and the fact of age and time, like you're getting jealous the older you get. Okay, so what this kind of unpacking of the story can help us do is to understand why the different bits are there. It doesn't really tell us much more than that. I mean, does it? I mean, we can sort of then take almost any part of the story and ask questions about it that generate some discussion that's interesting, sure. Like, why do the dwarfs work? Or why does Snow White do housework for them and that makes them happy? Why, what happens, what's curious about the way in which the wicked evil queen first gets jealous, then tries to use a hunter. Why a hunter? And then dresses herself, can't get anything done by the help, you have to do it yourself, dresses herself as a kindly looking but old, haggard apple seller, right? Someone who can be trusted. Why can the old be trusted? Might be a question. All right. Why is it a pig? A little animal that's like a human, right? I don't know whether that's a commentary on the dwarfs that are little but like humans, the little people who work, kind of not ableism, like equivalent of that prejudice. But that doesn't really give us any answers. But it makes us understand why the different elements in the story do what they do. Right? And that's really all that can also be said about the story of Snow White, you know. But it can be applied to other things as well, right? In one class I had a few years ago, I won't do this now, but the class suggested that we could try and do it with Feng Nhom, the story about the immortal Vietnamese story, right? The immortal stands for the desire to have freedom. In the time of the Hung Kings, there was a woman goes out, she sees big footprints, gets pregnant. How do you get pregnant from footprints? And gives birth to a child named Nhom. Chinese invaders come. The king needs hero. There are many versions of this story, right? Think of, well, Disney again, Mulan recently. So anyway, Gyong will asks this is a child, he asks his mother for steel, a horse, a saddle, a whip, and he'll fight the enemy. He decides to fight for freedom. The village gets him food and he grows. He was hungry before. We didn't get into all of the detail, but somehow the whip is broken, yet he wins. And afterwards he returns to the sky. Right? This is the kind of material that can be elucidated by a structuralist analysis to think about why the whip and why the whip needs to be broken or what. And yeah. So the myths that Levi-Strauss studies do this kind of storytelling, and his study tries to really bring out their logic. Right? Now, this mythological world, this science or this history of the mythic, of the people without writing, remember, it's focused on an imaginary time. Actually, I'm now taking up a commentary from Maurice Godelier and his book on Levi-Strauss. It's got that picture of Levi-Strauss, the famous one. Maurice Godelier was one of his, the age of his students. He was assistant to Levi-Strauss during the mythology period, right? But a Marxist anthropologist who's written really interesting stuff on mode of production debate. but this big fat book, right, 540 pages on Levi-Strauss. He is professor of anthropology at École des Hautes Études, where Derrida, École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales in Paris, where Derrida was as well. He writes about Levi-Strauss and makes a critique. So the myths are focused on an imaginary time, a remote past where gods and humans and animals and plants all live together. Think of Animus and Thoth, the Egyptians, or think of the gods of Hinduism with Ganesh, with the elephant head, and so on. Right? And humans and animals change into one another. Hence, Derrida's latest study on animals is interesting here too. But later then the world became what it is today. Animals ceased being people, people ceased being animals, and so on. But we still tell the myths as kind of, or at least, the Nambiguara, the Bororo, the American Indians all over the Americas still tell these stories and have totems that respect them and so on, as explanations of why things are. Right. So Levi-Strauss's first book in the mythologic series is from the raw and the cooked. Largely, it's about the origin of cooking, right, and the rules about food and so on. The second one is Honey to Ashes. It's about a series of myths that tell the story a little bit different. Honey is interesting. It's food from the forest that's kind of already cooked by the bees. I mean, it's processed by bees. So it's not just you pick an apple and eat, right? Pick an apple. You don't pick an apple in the jungle, do you? You pick a banana. And bees make honey. They kind of cook it in a way. It's processed anyway. But you also need culture to get at that. You need smoke or something. You need to use smoke or some kind of protection to avoid being eaten by the bees, basically. In this mythical time. And the other side, from honey to ashes, the ashes are things that are overcooked. But yet tobacco, when you make tobacco into ash, you also get culture. Right? So we've got to explain where does the idea of smoking come from, and how did, in the origin of table manners, the third volume, it's about where does the sun come from, the moon, heavenly bodies, and the naked man. It's about where do the different people come from, rivers, salmon, sexual organs, death, fire, all these things are explained in myths in a whole cycle that's, it's a massive study actually. 4 volumes, 2,000 pages, 813 myths from many variants from North and South American societies, plus comparatively 50 from China, Japan, Polynesia, a few from ancient Greece, Rome, ancient Europe, covering 350 tribes and ethnic groups, which implies reading. Levi-Strauss has read hundreds of books and articles in different languages. And the 4 volumes of mythology, he goes through lists of the technology of these tribal people, looks at ecological, astronomical, meteorological information. So he matches up like what stars they can see in the sky and what is in the mythology, because the myths talk about the stars as well. He examines maps. So Godelier is telling the story of all the different kinds of work that are behind Levi-Strauss's operation, right? Dozens of diagrams, old engravings, taxonomies of birds and animals, and supernatural figures. An exceptional achievement from every point of view, he says. And it is, it's amazing. Yet, what is Godelier's critique? What the Indians hear when they listen to their myths, right, individuals are being told a story. It's not just the story that's being told, as according to Levi-Strauss, which explains why women have periods or why the moon has spots, and what they're listening to is a discourse of the myths. And what they hear through the images, ideas, and symbolic figures underpinning the myths is the latent content of that discourse. But for Cordelia, this is where the problem lies. In several places, Levi-Strauss states that these stories are apparently without rhyme and reason, whereas we know, as does Levi-Strauss knows, that the Indians received and experienced them as existentially true. Right? Although we have problems with that formula, since it ignores the sacred, the divine order, and things like that. And Levi-Strauss also kind of says that the myths, there he is, in front of the collection of the volumes with all the stories. Levi-Strauss says at one point that the myths think, right? The myths make the arguments. They resolve the problems, right? The myths are almost, in their variations, they're kind of experimenting with solutions for problems. He says the myths should be seen as constituting local and temporary answers to problems raised by feasible adjustments and contradictions that they're endeavoring to legitimize or conceal. The content with which the myth endows itself is not anterior, not there in the myth, but behind the myth somehow, right? Behind the initial impulse to just deal with a problem. So far from deriving from one content or other, the myth moves towards a particular general answer. Right? All the different variations are searching for a problem to an issue with special importance, right? In each individual case, it alienates. It's a particular version of the story, and it's able to change different components of the myth to tell any kind of story, really. But there's, from another angle, no myth is the perfect version, but the version behind it is the one that is trying to solve the problem of why the moon has spots, or how did humans get fire and animals didn't? Why do we cook? Why do we have culture? Why do we have to explain these things? And Levi-Strauss also says, though, that these explanations are happening in his head, right? The logic of the myths is a logic that exists and flows through him, right? And it flows through the storytellers of the Baroro and the Nambikuara and so on. But he, because he's read them, and here he is, aged 101 with his medal from the president and so on, he's done this amazing study all of his life and become the conduit of what he says is the logic of the myths. But it's, Cordelia says, absurd. In the end, it's, or Geertz says, it's a signifying practice with nothing to say. Levi-Strauss's formulas are superb and provocative, but they literally make no sense. Myths are thoughts expressed in different languages, different myths, but they are not thinking subjects. They can neither operate in men's minds or reflect upon themselves. They really can't. So it must be the interpreting agent, Levi-Strauss, or a storyteller, or us reading Levi-Strauss, that discovers that myths have meaning. Right? It's like a physicist may as well say that the waves and particles that make up light are operating in his mind and reflecting themselves there. No, they really are. Well, it's reasonable to say men have invented the myths, right? Cordelia is strict on that point. Somebody has made up the stories, right? And it could be, in some cases, Levi-Strauss has interpreted them, but in others, it's the storytellers. And if we project myth, underlying logic, you miss very important aspects of culture. One is the story that's brought out when we see the chief do the writing lesson, that he uses writing for power. Well, storytelling is used for power as well. Not every person tells myths, and not everyone is, not every telling is innocent of an attempt to persuade someone to do things in a certain way, or why we do things, to accept how things are done, how things are done, to accept the order of that culture. The stories of the culture tell us which values we should follow. No, and some of them are, we have to accept our good values. So we happily, you should help your brother, you should help your sister, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't steal, don't be jealous, don't do value work. Although some are ethnocentric or prejudicial, unexamined assumptions, like that there are some people who are dwarves that work in mines and some who are princes that just wander around the forest looking for good things to do. Yay. Why is the prince, he's got special powers, of course, but why is he just wandering around? And why does Snow White fall for this guy with no job but to wander around the forest looking for damsels in distress? All right. So there's another dimension that's really missing from Levi-Strauss's work. Here in the photograph is an interesting one, is Levi-Strauss meeting with Sarkozy, the Prime Minister of France, from 10 years ago. Well, it looks like that Sarkozy has come to visit Levi-Strauss rather than Levi-Strauss's, right? Levi-Strauss seems to be telling the Prime Minister something. So whatever the political symbolism of this is evident, which is really what's missing from the analysis of the myth, which is politics. And Godelier says as much. Another set of relations is missing, and that's his Marxism comes out. These relations combine and should be described as a strategic component of the economic infrastructure of society. The relations of production, the social relations that determine the rights of groups of individuals that make up a society, who control or exploit or cause to exploit for their own benefit the elements of nature that are necessary for their existence and social reproduction. The class that are princesses and princes, as opposed to those that are having to work in the mines, right? And we have all sorts of social structures that legitimate and justify this mode of production, this arrangement, kinship, family, different valuations of what you should do and how you should behave. And this is the ethnographic material, but this is not examined or not included by Levi-Strauss in the mythology, except when he looks at the Chinook and a later book called The Jealous Potter is interesting in that regard, and the way of masks. He does a whole study of masks as well. That's really interesting. Some years after this, and let alone really remember this structuralist interest in what's in Tristra Peaks and the mythologies is now out of favor, and instead the reason why people are still interested in this book has to do with how it's also a book that first takes up the defense of the people that have been subjected to Western colonization. So the reason why the mythologies is still great, I suppose, is that we see there Levi-Strauss presenting Amerindian, the myths of the two hemispheres of the Americas, as the human mind in its in another state, right? Still somehow in touch with unwestern, uncolonized, a world which was before the disappearance of the buffalo and the plains of America, before the destruction of the rainforests, before the cocaine trade, the arms trade, the war on drugs, before geopolitics, there was this profound other way of thinking that is being destroyed and is lost. And for that reason, Tris Tropiques, the sadness of that loss and the crime of turning the whole world into a marketplace. I mean,